First, I'm going to cut a piece of wire the right length to wrap from the top of the power jack around the underside of the motherboard, and which will attach to the spot that we filed out on the underside of the motherboard. And that length of wire should do it. Now what I'm going to use here is a little device called Helping Hands I got at Radio Shack. It's actually missing one of its alligator clips, so it's actually a helping hand, but it'll work for what we're doing. And all it does is allows you to hold things while you work on them. It's like an extra set of hands. Okay, what I did there with the helping hand was solder both ends of that wire, which I didn't catch on film, but I'll show you afterwards. And then I just put a dab of solder on the back of the power jack there, on that spot I was filing, right at the back of the power jack, that pin. It's the positive point. The whole outside of that power jack, the metal on the outside, is negative. That's ground, your ground connection. And my hand's in the way, but you'll see the finished product. I will hold it up to the camera. I just soldered that wire to the back of the power jack. And then I bent it around the underside of the motherboard. And now I'm going to solder it to the point that we filed down on the underside of the motherboard. Now that point on the underside of the motherboard, which right now I'm attaching, I'm just putting a little drop of solder on it. And then I'm going to just take the wire, which also has solder on the end of the wire already, which I did with the helping hands. I'm just going to melt that point onto the point of the motherboard where I just dropped a piece of solder. Now that point on the motherboard that we filed earlier, you need to make sure that that point is the exact spot that the pin from the power jack actually connects to on the motherboard. You can't just connect it to any spot on the motherboard. It has to be, you have to find out where that pin on the power jack goes to on the motherboard, and then you have to attach the solder or the wire to that point, which you'll see right there. Now I'm going to freeze frame that. Now notice that wire is attached to the motherboard right where that pin comes through the underside of the motherboard. It's essentially the same contact point. That's very important. You could tell it's the same contact point because of the light green color. Well, now that that's connected, and we tested with the pliers to make sure it was a strong connection, the soldering is essentially done. Give it a little tug, make sure it's secure. And you'll see that basically what we're doing here is bypassing the pin for the power jack with the wire. It's better to use a wire, in my opinion, because of the flexibility, like I said before. Now what we're going to do is clear off the desk a little bit and start to put everything back together. Put the soldering iron away, put the helping hands, wires away, files away. Now that you have the motherboard out, hit it with some compressed air. Now's your chance to make sure the motherboard is clean. It's fully exposed. You might as well take that opportunity and clean it up a little bit. And we're going to take the bottom case. We're going to slip the motherboard back in. Take out my trusty paintbrush here and just paint the dust off of the... It's just a bare paintbrush, never been touched by paint. And we're going to just take the dust off of the bottom case with the paintbrush. Okay, you want to make sure you get the motherboard lined up properly. And if you notice anything else on the motherboard that you need to do before you put it in, now's the time. And what I'm doing now is, as I was eyeing it up, I saw that there might be some metal in the bottom part of the case that might hit that wire that we just attached. So I'm going to take a piece of electrical tape, maybe two, and cover up the exposed wire that we just attached, just in case there's a ground point on the bottom part of the case that would hit it and cause a short circuit. So we're basically insulating the job we did. Now we have to do that sometimes because using the wire because that's not what was originally in the machine. It might jut out a little bit and make contact with a piece of metal, you know, in the bottom case or somewhere else in the machine. Make sure you get it in exactly right. It should fit in exactly right. There shouldn't be any points that are forced upwards or bent. It should fit in perfectly. If it's not, find out why. Like for this example, there's a connector that's under there that needs to come up on the upper side of the motherboard rather than sitting on the underside of the motherboard. And once it's in there solidly, it's time to screw the screws back in. And remember, the screws go where the white arrows are. Okay, we're going to make sure all the screws are in. I'm just being very careful here. This is the point where you have to be careful. You're using all the original screws. So when you get the whole thing back together, you're not left with some stray screws, which has happened to me often in the beginning. Now I'm going to take more electrical tape and do the same thing to the underside of the motherboard as I did with the top part we did. Just cover up that contact point that we created. Just because with the wire there, it might be jutting out or popping out a little bit higher than was originally there with the original solder connection. So we just want to be extra careful. Because as you can see, the whole top of this upper case is metal. And if that positive red wire that we just attached, which is the positive in the circuit, touches that metal, which is ground, which is negative, we're going to create a short circuit. So you really don't want that to happen. So just if you feel the least bit apprehensive about it, cover up your work with electrical tape. You'll be okay. Okay, we just want to make sure this lines up exactly, and it should snap right in. I'm going to pull that one wire through, which is actually the wireless card wire. Just make sure that's in the right spot. Pull it up and through. There it is. The whole case snaps back on. And there's my pile of screws. Time to just put them all back. And what I'm actually going to do is speed up the recording here, because you saw how I took it apart. You use the same screws to put it back together. You don't need to watch it in real time. It would probably get a little boring. And very important, as you can see what I was doing there, attach all the ribbon cables that you unattached in the beginning. Like the ribbon cable that goes to the touchpad. That needs to attach to the motherboard. And any other ribbon cables that are there. It would be really nice if I could work this fast in real time, wouldn't it? Put the heatsink back on. Now I screw the heatsink in a cross pattern, like you're putting on a tire. You don't want to put too much pressure on one side of the heatsink and hurt your processor. So put it on a couple turns here, a couple turns there, just like you're putting on a tire. That's how I put heatsinks back on the processors. Put your wireless card in, put the hard drive in, put the RAM back in, put the covers back on, and we're almost done here. Make sure you get all the screws in, put the CD drive in, held in by one screw. Get the screen back on. Attach the LCD cable, attach the wireless card cable, which is basically an antenna that usually, the screen usually has an LCD cable and the wireless card cable coming through it. And that wireless card cable goes to the top of the screen to provide an antenna. Attach all the ribbon cables. Now these screws I'm screwing in now are actually holding in the hinges of the screen. I couldn't put these in until I actually had the screen in, otherwise there would be no threads. The hinges actually have the threads in them. And now that that's tight, put the keyboard back on. Make sure it's attached properly. Put the two screws on that hold the keyboard on. Then snap that panel back into place, which we know doesn't have any screws holding it in from the bottom. We know that now. Make sure it's in tight. Make sure that it fits in exactly how it was when you first took it apart. And there you have it. Now let's test it out. Plug the power adapter in. Before we do that, it's actually a good idea to test if there's a short circuit in your work before you plug the power adapter in, because you don't want to mess anything up. So I'm taking the red there, I'm attaching it to the center pin of the power jack, and that black connection is actually hitting a ground point on the other side of the computer, which you can't see. And if I hear a beep on my power meter, that will indicate a short circuit, and then I know I did something wrong. I have to take the whole thing apart. It would have been smart to test this before I put the whole thing back together, but I'm getting cocky now in my work, so sometimes I put it all together knowing that it's just going to work. Plug the power adapter in, and we're going to take a look down at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen there. You're going to see that the light comes on. It powers on. This is with no battery, so we know that it's working. And that's how you do it. A power jack repair on a Dell B130 laptop.